Hi, everybody. I'm here today to talk about ideas for how we can go back to work. And one first point I'd like to make is how I think about things. So I don't claim to have all the answers. I don't claim to have all the ideas, but by walking through this process, I could share with you how I think about it, and maybe that'll benefit you. So first thing is you have critics and you have leaders or creators. Art world, you have artists and you have critics. In work world, in politics, well, really in government and business, you have leaders and you have critics. And what is the difference? Okay, voters are critics. Your right is to vote. You're a citizen. You don't have to have a vast knowledge of the issues. You don't have to come up with solutions. You can pick and choose what side of any issue to emphasize, and you can vote that. So you're free to do whatever you want as a voter. Media are critics. So when I look at the press briefings, I see a disconnect between the team, who are people that are actually doing things, they're creating things, they're trying to solve problems, and the media, who really don't have any idea what that is. And that's just the nature of being in journalism. You report things, you talk about things, but they don't have to know what it takes to actually get something done. And that's what's been frustrating for me, because I can't read news or watch news and know what our government's doing. I can't know what actually was presented in those press briefings by watching the news, because they don't even try to understand it. They're just looking for the headline, looking for the story. And employees. As an employee, you can be a critic. You can complain about this issue or that issue, and you don't necessarily have to worry about why an issue exists or why there are limitations on implementing solutions that you might think are simple, because you just have your perspective and you're well within your right to share it. So, but someone has to actually do this work of creating things and making things happen. Critics can overemphasize one issue over another. I call this oversimplification. Okay, but leaders have to work with everything, all the issues, to create real solutions. And I see that every time I watch one of the press briefings, is the press looking for the simple answer, and but the people behind the podium being forced to solve the problems. For example, a Governor Cuomo can scream that he wants 30,000 ventilators. He can make an emotional statement about, you tell who's going to die. You tell the person who's going to die. And that's great for media. That's a great story. That's great, something great that they can run. But what was the end result? He doesn't need 30,000 ventilators, okay? And if you watched the press briefing last night, you heard Trump, not specifically to New York, but how he spoke to the fact that different areas have asked for resources that they didn't believe they need. So the federal government is acting as a resource to provide guidance, equipment, and things to help hospitals and cities solve their problems, but they have to worry about the entire country. They have to worry about every city, every state. And if the governor of New York says, I want 30,000 ventilators, and the federal government says, well, that's all we have, or that's more than we have, and if we give them all to him, then we don't have any for anyone else. So they have to, and they realize Cuomo cares about New York. That's his role. That's what, his responsibility is. So, if you're Governor Cuomo's role and someone tells you 30,000, then you want 30,000. That's just the reality of it. But if you're in charge of the federal government and you have a limited resource and you have one person to, we kind of, complain about individuals hoarding. But this is really a case of hoarding, isn't it? I mean, this is a case of someone going to the store and buying up all the toilet paper. Now, I don't want to minimize it, okay? I mean, yes, Governor Cuomo, he has a huge responsibility, a huge burden on his shoulders, and that is the hotspot in the country. But the reality of it is the federal government has to worry about everyone. So they have to kind of use their judgment when someone asks for things. Now, if the federal government only gave him 1,000 and it turned out he needed 5,000, they're in a position and they're setting it up so that they can send that out quickly. But again, there's an example in the media, as a New Yorker, as a viewer and reader. You could say, what's wrong with Trump? What's wrong with, this guy in charge of logistics? Why, they're not taking a leadership role. They're not doing their jobs as the federal government, leaving Cuomo hanging out to dry. Well, I mean, those critics don't have to, they're not going to be responsible if the federal government gives all the ventilators to New York. Turns out they don't even need them. And then people are dying on the streets and in the hospitals of Louisiana. And, the federal government then has to, they have to own that. They have to be responsible for that. So there's a difference between being a critic and being a leader. Having responsibility for the results, having responsibility for everything that happens and not just the one. You can't just pick and choose. Let's talk about some ideas for going back to work. But first, we have to look at the reality, the public health cautions. Okay. You can't ignore public health when you talk about the economy, and you can't ignore the economy and only care about public health. So, second wave. My previous video, I talked about that. It's a real concern. As soon as we go back to interacting and, as soon as the people start gathering in groups and working together, we're likely to get a second wave. So we have to be prepared to deal with that. And then really, if we get a second wave, does that just nullify all the sacrifice we just made? So unintended consequences of infection. So this is me. Okay, I didn't read this anywhere. It's just a thought I had that, okay, so right now our plan is to keep the virus, give the virus no place to go, right? By staying separate, there's nowhere for the virus to go. Well, if we just go herd immunity and we allow the virus to spread essentially to low-risk people, do we really know if there are unintended consequences to now having a huge number, the majority possibly of Americans infected with this virus? Does that make it more difficult to protect high-risk people? It probably does, right? I mean, you go out now, the grocery store is one of the more places you're more likely to be infected, but your chances of getting infected are the precautions you take, but also how many people in there are actually infected. The more people that are infected going into the grocery stores, the more likely the entire all the employees of the store are going to become infected. And can the store even remain open at that? So we really have to think about unintended consequences of just letting the virus run its course. Again, I don't know. Is mutation a concern? I've heard it's a pretty stable virus and everything. But if you let it kind of take over, if you will, the population, are there other concerns relative to mutation or other health consequences? Is it possible that the kind of scope of the problem in terms of the virus and the health effects and conditions, does that sort of change if we go from a minority of the people being infected to literally the majority? I don't know. That would have to ask. But number one, okay, this is job one in all this. We can't overwhelm the hospitals. And, that's a pillar of our society, right? People get injured, people get sick. We expect that they can go to the hospital and be treated. And we're looking at a situation where, okay, maybe you don't have COVID, but regardless of your personal family situation, I don't believe that any Americans want to see us in a position where we have people dying in the parking lots of hospitals and they can't be treated. And what about when all the hospital workers become infected? So overwhelming the hospital is a real thing. Even if you're low risk, what happens if your child breaks a leg? What happens if someone in your family has an appendicitis and the hospitals just can't even keep up with all the COVID stuff? So, and as you know, the Navy ship that is in New York, that was the original intent, was for that to treat patients for other things, so that the hospitals can focus solely on COVID. Okay, but all right, so if we're going to do this, we have to have some ideas, tactics, right? And we have to be able to measure some things, because we're talking about allowing low-risk people to go to work, isolating the high-risk people, but at the same time, still trying to manage. I mean, what good is it if all the low-risk people go to work, they all get sick at the same time, and then the entire workforce is sick? And, so that doesn't help. So you do have to be able to track what's going on and manage it. So I'll use the example of the 5-minute point of care test from Abbott Laboratories. There's other options. There are a lot of different choices on the table, but this is a 5-minute point of care test. So it's probably the closest to being able to say, I mean, if you think about it, how often do you test people? If you say, okay, we're going to go back to work and we want to test all of our workforce, you kind of have to do it every day, okay? Or as frequently as possible. So this is the closest one to that. It's point of care and it's quick. So there are other tests out there they're working on for testing immunity. So if you can run a test, I don't know if they call them the antibody test, but determine that a particular person is immune and they're not a carrier, then they're fine to go. And that would be a useful thing to know to start getting a count for how many people that applies to. That could help us understand the risk of all this. And then treatments, okay? So maybe you can't stop it from spreading, but we've got chloroquine out there. I've seen some other existing meds that are safe, known to be safe to give to human treatments. And, so there may be ways of if people that do go to the hospital, treating them so they get well quicker and they go home instead of going on a ventilator and hope for the best. Okay, the other piece of this would be sealing off maybe high-risk areas. Is that something practical? How do we do that? And is it legal? So you may have others, okay? I'm just giving you a way of thinking about this, but I would encourage you don't think about this as a critic. Don't just pick your one thing that you think is the magic bullet, because there is no magic bullet. But think about this. If you were in charge and you were responsible for solving these problems, what could you do? Because then at least your expectations are in the realm of possibility. They're practical. They're realistic. A lot of what we're hearing people say, and again, people can be critics if they want to, but their input is very limited in value. Okay, so and the last thing is vaccines and untested treatments. That's what would have stopped us from getting into this position in the first place. But they're far longer term. They're post second wave, so they're there, but that's not part of a go to back to work strategy. All right, so let's look at this. If we're going to do it, let's think about logistics and what I call volume business. Okay, because unless you've done volume work, sometimes people take, well, that looks really simple. It only takes 5 minutes. You just do this, boom, everything's fine. Well, you have to scale that up, right? And when you start to scale something up and you take a product, if you will, from low volume to high volume, it's a whole nother animal. Okay. And by the way, the admiral who's the logistics person moving, he understands that. So if you listen to him talking, that's what he's talking about. Okay, so let's talk about the capacity. If we had a 5-minute point of care test, what's our capacity? So if you're in a factory and you're building something that uses a machine to build it, what's the capacity of that machine? Okay, so and what does it look like on a national scale? So if we scale this up to nationally. So 15 minutes for a negative. Most people are negative. So we really can't say 5-minute test, right? Even in New York, the hot spots were in the 30-some% positive range. So that means most people that take a test in that area are going to, in any area really, are going to take 15 minutes. So just to make for orders of magnitude, to make the calculations simpler, let's just assume 10 minutes or 6 per hour. So we could run 6 tests every hour. And if you assume a 10-hour continuous day, so that means a person running that machine nonstop for 10 hours. I mean, if someone takes a lunch break, someone has to step in and relieve them. You can't have that person doing other jobs, okay? They have to be focused 100% for 10 hours a day. Then we can get 60 tests per day. Now, obviously, you could run another shift and get 120, but let's just stick with 60 for now. Okay. Right now, there are 18,000 of these machines out there. I mean, I heard they're, scaling or preparing to ship out another 2,000 new. Maybe, hopefully they can do more, but let's just assume we have 20,000 machines. Again, round numbers. So if we have 20,000 machines and we can run 60 tests per machine per day, that's one shift, then we can do 1.2 million tests per day. Now that sounds really good. Okay. And, the president would say, that's more tests than anybody's ever done. Okay. But our population is 340 million people. Let's just assume 300 million. Okay. Not everybody needs to be tested. It's going to take 250 days to test every person one time, just one time. Okay. 250 days. We're looking at little over 4.5 months, say. So 4.5 months to get everybody tested just once. And now we already said you got to test them fairly frequently, right? If you want to ensure this. So kind of big, right? Now, all right. What if we just say workers? At the peak of our economy there, I believe we had 160 million workers. So we're only going to test workers. We're going to quarantine everyone else or isolate them, whatever. So we're still talking 133 days, okay, over 4 months. Can we really use testing to ensure that infected people are quickly isolated, quickly identified and isolated? Yeah. Let's keep going, though. All right. So how would we implement it? So let's say, okay, we're going to work with those numbers. We're going to scale it up. We're going to double it. It's only going to take 2 months. All right, so like I already said, you would have to have workers assigned to the machine full time. So if the machine is your limiting factor, you need to make sure that you have the machine running constantly. So that would mean you would need personnel, 20,000 workers per shift running the machines. You would probably need more than that because, as I said, if someone takes a break or goes to the bathroom, the machine's not running. So you need to keep these guys running constantly. You also need to make sure you're bringing enough samples into the machine. So, if we have 20,000 machines geographically evenly distributed, but in one area, we're not actually even producing 60 tests per hour, then you might have, so your machine's being underutilized, and let's say it's in a more populated city where they have more than 60 per hour, they may not even be able to keep up with all the tests. So you have to keep, so my point being, what is your limiting factor? If it's the machine, then you need to make sure that you have manpower on that machine so it's running all the time, and you need to have raw material feeding that machine to keep it going. Okay, so if you don't have enough manpower to keep it running full time, then the manpower becomes your limiting factor. So you have to bring that up. If you keep it operating, but you're not bringing enough raw material, or in this case samples, to be tested, then again, you're never going to hit your 1.2 million per day because you're not providing enough raw material into the system. So who manages this? 20,000 machines running, 1.2 million tests a day. The federal government? I mean, that's kind of what we seem to go. Everybody seems to default to that, right? What's the federal government? What's the president? We want to boil this down to one man, so it all falls on the president. But, that's a big thing to manage. And, the president's not going to manage it, obviously. So what if you break it down by state? Well, if you take 20,000 machines, they wouldn't be evenly distributed, but let's just assume for the sake of example they are. That's 400 per state. It starts to become a lot more manageable, right? So you delegate it down. So in something like this, the federal government can provide the guideline, the procedure to follow, the standard requirements, that sort of thing, and push that out to the states, and then you could have the states. But you can even break it down to more manageable pieces from there. You go down to the county level, the city level. You could do it within hospital systems. For the most part, if you provided the guidance to do this, the hospital systems are going to take up and do it anyway. Employers, what if you have large employers where a lot of employees have to be in close proximity? They want to open for business. They'll do what they can to implement a test. That might bring into the picture private testing companies. Maybe you go to a Quest Diagnostics and you have your tests done on a Monday, and that's a requirement for you to go to work. Now, bear in mind, if we do that, how many people can a Quest Diagnostic? How many people was that place designed to handle? So Fauci has said, and now maybe you see why, we can't test our way out of this problem. Okay, so again, testing is a tool. Testing is something that can help a lot, and it can be a valuable thing. But maybe a critic can sit there and say, we got to do more testing. We got to do more testing. Look at all the testing that South Korea is doing. They're doing more testing. We got to do. We can't test our way out of this problem. It's a tool, it would help, but it's not the magic bullet. So a critic can think it is, but a leader can't. As far as, let's talk about legal. Now, governors have authority for their states. The president has authority over the federal government. He doesn't necessarily have total authority over all the states, right? I don't know what the legal lines are, okay? But ask yourself, think this through. What does it look like for the president of the United States to exercise control over the movement of people within the states and within the country? I mean, it's controversial when the president says we're not going to let people come in from the country that has the disease in the first place, China. That's a controversy. What's going to happen when the president says we're sealing off New York City? Nobody goes in, nobody comes out. What? Really? I mean, again, I don't know the legal limitations on that, but let's just picture what that would look like on a practical level. Can we really do that? So now, as a critic, okay, and I'm not saying that as an insult, okay, it's just a reality. We're all in that position. But you may be a parent. You may be, you're familiar with how schools work, small business, whatever. So, without thinking this through, this idea of controlling people and putting some rules in place and saying, you stay home, and you do this. It seems like a very doable, manageable thing, okay? But then, that experience on a smaller scale does not apply on the United States of America and 343 million people in 50 states. I mean, totally different animals, okay? Totally different. We have this thing, constitutional rights. So, okay, you can't manage what you can't measure. I think Jack Welch, GE, said that. So it's a business thing, right? You have metrics, you want to measure, and a lot of us have been asking that. We want to see what the models are that they're using. They're not giving us enough. We want to be able to track it ourselves and, things like that. So if you want to manage this, what we're doing now requires a lot less management. It just asks people to do their part and stay home. If we go back to work and we want to kind of control the spread of the disease and protect people, this takes a lot more management. It takes a lot more measurement. Okay, so our federal government has been set up, and it can be. I'm not saying it is. I think the criticism a lot of times for hurricane response and earthquakes is politics more than reality. But FEMA, our federal government, set up to address regional problems. So if a state has an emergency, the federal government can bring resources and help, and they can take a lead role and be the primary fixer of that problem because the states aren't equipped to do it. But this is a national problem. Okay, this is a scale that none of us have ever seen, even bigger scale than 9/11. So the idea that the federal government just can step in and the president can just step in and fix this problem, and why isn't he doing that? It's just not realistic, okay? The other thing in politics, it's easy for governors, mayors, local politicians to deflect responsibility to the federal government. Also to beg for help. I mean, they're scared. Cuomo used scary rhetoric to try to get his 30,000 ventilators, but in reality, doesn't look like he needs anywhere near 30,000. So again, I mean, we have to be smart about this. Yes, I mean, I hear an emotional plea from New York City, and that really hurts me to the core. But and I can be a critic and just say, fix that need, or you're a heartless, bad leader. You're free to do that and vote for another guy. But in reality, is that fair? Is that really a practical way of looking at it? So that's all I wanted to offer today. And, so that's my model. Okay. That's how I look at things. Someone who's tasked with responsibility to solve complex problems, to lead teams of people, and to try to figure out the best way to get from point A to point B. When I look at big national emergencies and things like that, that's the approach I take. I try not to be the critic and try to be an informed, and, I don't know, it helps me. Okay. It helps me to, run that through in my brain. All right. Thank you very much for watching. Be blessed. I'm still kind of pumped. We feel like we're trending in a positive direction. And I really think that we're going to start seeing some movement on this go back to work strategy. Be blessed.